So today we'll be talking about the U.S. influence and origins of evangelicalism in Brazil. So an overview of our topic. What are we going to talk about in this presentation? So first we're going to explain the socio-political relevance of evangelicalism in modern Brazil, and then we'll provide a brief historical context and early developments. We'll trace the evolution and growth of U.S. influence to Brazilian adaptation. That's a shift that occurs. And then we'll later analyze the modern impact on Brazilian society and politics. So let's begin. So why is it relevant? So it's relevant because it's been growing so much. So evangelicals in Brazil went from about 5% of the population in 1970 to about 30 to 35% today. So that's over 1/3 of a population of over hundreds of millions of people in one of the biggest countries on earth. That's a huge percent of the population, 1 out of 3 people. Catholics used to be 90% of the population in 1970, and today they're about 50%. So it's the fastest growing religious group in Brazil. It's a major electoral bloc, and this is a more recent development from around the 2010s to now 2026. And these statistics were acquired from the Pew Research Center. So it's growing, it's already large, and it's continuing to grow. So that's why we need to talk about it to understand Brazilian culture. So the historical origins. So the U.S. Protestant missionaries post-Civil War introduced evangelical theology and church structure into Brazil. This is actually related to things like the Confederados, or the Confederate refugees that relocated to southern Brazil. It's part of that same not directly related, but indirectly, that same sort of movement of U.S. culture expanding throughout the Western Hemisphere. So the Southern Baptist Convention and the Presbyterian Church within the U.S., they built schools and churches with the intent of establishing a long-term institutional presence, mostly in southern Brazil. And the mission strategy targeted education and local leadership development to spread Protestant ideas. So they were really just trying to start from the ground up, a very decentralized approach. Which makes sense because this is Protestantism. But early growth remained very limited because Brazil was firmly dominated by Catholics and Catholic elites. So they sort of restricted Protestantism in many ways. And so now we're going to go to the rapid expansion from the 1950s to the 1990s, so the late 20th century. So the Pentecostal movement, which is a very Southern Baptist movement, they expanded rapidly because they offered a more sort of emotional, expressive, experiential worship that was very different than traditional Catholicism, which is, let's think about it, it's traditional, it's hierarchical. When you go to a Catholic Mass, you can't be as expressive, you can't talk out of turn. And this is very distinct from Pentecostal worship. And if you know anything about Pentecostal worship, it's very expressive. There's speaking in tongues, which is not traditionally a Catholic practice, although some groups do this. And in a sense, they actually played into the cultural fabric of Brazil because culturally the stereotype is that Brazilians are very expressive and emotional. And so in some sense, they were sort of taking advantage of that basis to grow their faith. And so the Assemblies of God grew. They were Brazil's largest evangelical group, and they adapted to local communities. There's an emphasis on healing and miracles that definitely attracted the poor, lower income, and urban populations that were facing increasing instability, because let's talk about this time period. There was a lot of internal migration in Brazil during the 1950s to the 1990s, growth of cities, and people lacked identity, and the church offered, a way of identity that wasn't as strict in some ways as traditional Catholicism in terms of social barriers. So Brazilian transformation. So as we get into the 21st century, we see the growth of Brazilian churches. They sort of transformed the U.S. models, by bringing mega churches and growing through mass media. So they took advantage of Brazil's cultural fabric, and they also took advantage of the growth of technology and mass media and the modernization that was happening to Brazil during the 1990s. And so the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, it was founded in 1977, and this is a major institution. It expanded nationally. It integrated religion with TV and with radio networks. So again, taking advantage of of that technology. And Edir Macedo, a very important evangelical, he built a lot of influence by combining religious authority with the media control that we're talking about. And so these sort of personalist figures began to grow in Brazil around the same time, that they were growing as well in the United States with the growth of religious radio talk show hosts. And so there's a concept called prosperity theology, prosperidade, teologia da prosperidade, and it's common in the United States, but it began to grow too in Brazil at this time. And it sort of framed Christian faith as a path for financial and personal success. And that sort of increased the appeal to those of lower incomes. So you could see famous pastors in Houston, like Joel Osteen, that preach prosperity theology. So this began to grow in Brazil in the 21st century. And Brazil shifted from a receiver to an exporter. So now Brazilian Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism, is being spread from Brazil to other parts of Latin America and across the Lusophone world in different ways, expanding globally. So we see, initially we shifted from U.S. dominance to now the Brazilian sort of independence of their own Protestant movement. So now the next slide, political impact, 2000 to present. So I'm just going to touch on the political impact, and we'll get into more of the details in a moment. But as evangelical churches grew, the networks that coordinated their messaging and influence, also grew, and they began to realize, hey, we're a political bloc now. So there was the creation of the Bancada Evangelica. So it emerged as a political bloc. Bancada, remember, a bench that represents evangelical interests in Congress. So now this shared religious identity, creates high alignment on moral and social policy issues. And you can see this evidence for this in the support for the former president Jair Bolsonaro, in the 2018 and that just demonstrated the power that Brazilian Protestants were beginning to have as an electoral force.